The first sight of Harry Potter came to Severus Snape in a blaze of candles. The boy did not know it. He sat on the stool beneath the patched brim of the sorting hat, all elbows and bones and nervous defiance, his school robes hanging on him as though they had been borrowed from some better-fed child. But the hall had gone very quiet, and Severus, who had spent more than a decade mastering the art of stillness, felt something inside him lurch with such violence that for one absurd instant he thought he might have made a visible movement and betrayed himself before the whole school. It was not the scar. Everyone saw that first. The lightning cut white against the dark, unruly fringe was spectacle enough for a hall full of children who had grown up on stories and bloodless legends. It was not the thin face either, though that face was James Potter's in miniature. The same shape, the same insolent lines, only starved of arrogance by neglect and years too young yet for conceit. It was the eyes. Green, clear, and alive. For a moment Lily Evans stood where her son stood, and the world, which had become a machinery of duty and calculation, broke open along an old, carefully sealed seam. "Gryffindor!" cried the hat. The hall erupted. Red and gold banners shook in the draft from the high rafters. The Gryffindor table banged and shouted. The boy, Harry Potter, Harry Potter. The name was already rippling through the hall like a dropped stone disturbing dark water. Pulled off the hat and went to join his new house with an expression that mixed relief and bewilderment in almost equal measure. Severus folded his hands more tightly. At his left, Albus Dumbledore's profile remained serene, yet there was a minute watchfulness in the old man's gaze. He knew, of course. He always knew too much. On Severus's other side, Professor Quirrell dabbed at his lips with a napkin, his fingers fluttering as though each motion required a separate act of courage. Quirrell had returned from his year abroad, altered in ways he likely believed subtle. His stammer had grown less innocent and more strategic. His hands shook even when he had no audience. The ridiculous turban he affected now carried, beneath garlic and stale cloth and the scent of damp wool, another smell that Severus had not managed to identify, but had not liked in the least. It was not rot, exactly. Rot was simple. This was thinner, sharper, like a place where life had once been and had been peeled away. When the applause died, Dumbledore rose, spread his arms, and spoke his usual genial foolishness. A warning about the forbidden forest. A mention of the third-floor corridor. The children laughed when he said, "Off limits," and nearly preened with eagerness. 11-year-olds, Severus thought, were creatures specially designed to fling themselves toward danger if it were cloaked in a rule. Across the hall, Harry Potter looked up at the staff table and flinched when his gaze met Severus. Good, Severus thought automatically, and then despised himself for the reflex. The child had done nothing. He had only inherited a face, a name, a history, and those eyes. The feast appeared. Gold platters filled in an instant. Conversation rose, bright and hungry. Quirrell leaned toward Dumbledore and murmured something beneath the noise. Severus caught only fragments: the security of the object, the need for vigilance, the weakness of certain spells under pressure. Dumbledore answered in a voice too low to distinguish. The old fool trusted too many moving parts. The stone had been brought into the school under concealment strong enough to keep the ministry and most of the staff in ignorance. Yet if one was forced to house a treasure under the nose of every curious child in Britain, Hogwarts was admittedly the least bad place in the country to do it. Still, Severus did not like Quirrell's interest in the matter, nor did he like the concealed hunger beneath the man's nervous politeness. He had marked it before term began, in private discussions with Dumbledore, and Dumbledore had agreed only that Quirrell was to be watched. So he watched. He watched Quirrell's pale hand stray too often toward the turban as though confirming its position. He watched the way Quirrell avoided looking directly at him, except when forced. He watched Dumbledore's expression remain mild, while those bright old eyes missed nothing. And because he was a man who had long ago learned that survival lay in attention, he also watched Harry Potter laugh uncertainly at something the Weasley boy said, watched the bushy-haired Granger girl lean forward, already eager to answer questions not yet asked. Watched the Malfoy heir measure the famous child. The feast ended. The first years were herded away, awed and whispering, by Minerva McGonagall daughter. The hall emptied in currents of black cloth and candle smoke. Only then did Dumbledore turn his head slightly and say, without looking at Severus, "You may stop trying to appear unaffected. It does not suit you." Severus kept his face expressionless. "I have no idea what you mean." "Of course not. He is his father in every line." "No," said Dumbledore softly. "Not every line." Quirrell rose too quickly, nearly upset his goblet, apologized to no one in particular, and hurried from the hall. Severus watched him go. "He grows stranger." Dumbledore's eyes followed the retreating figure. "The world often leaves marks on those who wander alone. The world is not all that has marked him." "Perhaps not." It was as much agreement as Dumbledore was likely to offer. Severus inclined his head once and left the hall. The days that followed settled into their patterns with the clockwork inevitability of autumn term. Castle rhythms took hold. Children ceased to gape at the moving staircases and began instead to curse them. Robes acquired the smell of parchment and smoke. The first years learned the geography of fear, transfiguration with McGonagall's cold exactitude, charms with Flitwick's benign precision, potions with Severus Snape. When Gryffindor and Slytherin first years filed into the dungeon classroom, the torches burned blue against the stone, and the air smelled of copper, herbs, and simmering roots. The room never failed to work its effect on new students. Even the boldest generally felt the old instinctive caution of animals, entering a place where things might bubble, shatter, or scald. Harry Potter sat between Ronald Weasley and Neville Longbottom, trying very hard not to look impressed. Severus called the roll without inflection. Each name fell flat as lead into the quiet until he reached the one he had known would change the atmosphere. "Harry Potter." "Here," said the boy. Heads lifted. A few students smirked. Draco Malfoy, whose contempt was already disciplined into elegance, turned slightly in his seat. "Ah, yes," said Severus, letting the silence draw. "Harry Potter, our new celebrity." There was the expected ripple of laughter from Slytherin. Weasley flushed. Potter stiffened. The green eyes, Lily's cursed, impossible eyes, met his with plain dislike. "Good," he thought again, and again found no satisfaction in it. He moved at once into the questions. "Potter, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" The boy blinked. Severus saw the whole thing in miniature. The years with muggles, the absence of any mother's tutoring, the newspapers, the stories, the fame that had drifted around the child like smoke before Head had enough sense to understand it. He saw, too, the immediate defensive anger, the refusal to lower his eyes or ask for time. James would have attempted a swaggering guess. The boy simply glared. "I don't know, sir." "Tut, tut. Fame clearly isn't everything." Severus let the room laugh again. "Let us try again. Where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar?" Another blank. The Granger girl's hand shot into the air hard enough to shake the sleeve of her robe. "I don't know, sir." "And what is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" The hand waved now like a distress signal. Potter's jaw tightened. "I don't know," he said again. "Clearly then, fame has not been accompanied by preparation. Sit down." The girl practically vibrated in frustration. Severus turned to her. "Miss Granger?" She reeled off the answers at admirable speed and nearly tolerable self-satisfaction. "Draught of living death. Goat's stomach." They were the same plant, also called aconite. Her knowledge was correct. Her expression said she wanted praise. Severus gave her none. "As you see, Potter," he said, "some students arrive at school intending to use the opportunity they have been given." A muscle moved in the boy's cheek. Hatred settled there swiftly, cleanly, with the simplicity of childhood. A professor was cruel. Therefore, a professor was enemy. It would have been easier if it had truly been that simple. The lesson went on. Cauldrons hissed. Neville Longbottom melted one pewter spoon and nearly his own eyebrows. Weasley chopped scarab beetles with the same solemn incompetence he brought to everything academic. Miss Granger answered questions no one had put to her. Malfoy worked neatly and looked up only when he thought someone might be watching. Potter followed instructions well enough for a novice, which irritated Severus more than open clumsiness would have done. James had been brilliant and insufferable. To discover in James Potter's son a capacity for patience was inconvenient. After class, students stamped out in a storm of relieved noise. Potter lingered only because Longbottom had contrived to spill nettle infusion over his own notes and Ron Weasley's as well. The three of them bent over the desk, salvaging what they could. Severus should have ignored them. Instead, he heard himself say, "Longbottom, mop that properly before you leave. Weasley, if you mean to assist, use your wand hand for something other than flailing. Potter." The boy looked up sharply. Severus almost said, "Keep your head down. Watch Quirrell. Do not go looking for whatever glitters simply because someone tells you it is forbidden." What came out instead was, "You will not survive this subject by staring about the room as if it owes you something." Potter's eyes flashed. "I wasn't staring, sir." "No? Then perhaps the deficiency is only in your skill and not your attention. How reassuring." Weasley made a strangled noise that might have been indignation or suppressed laughter. Potter stuffed his damp parchment into his bag and stalked out with all the offended dignity an undersized 11-year-old could muster. Severus watched him go. By the second week of term, the entire school knew Harry Potter could fly. The story reached the staff table before luncheon. Neville Longbottom had broken his wrist. Draco Malfoy had stolen the Fool Boy's Remembrall. Potter had flown to retrieve it in open defiance of Madame Hooch's instructions. And Minerva, instead of expelling him as most students assumed she must, had marched him straight off the grounds and returned with Oliver Wood wearing the kind of exalted expression reserved for religious visions and championship prospect. Severus stared across the hall at the Gryffindor table. Potter was surrounded by admirers trying and failing to seem casual. He looked startled by the attention rather than pleased, which was almost worse. Innocent heroism had a talent for drawing people into its orbit. James had always known when he was adored. Lily had always been surprised. "Your face," said Dumbledore pleasantly, "is one of the many small joys of my profession." "He's a first year. And very talented." "He's a target." That damped the old man's amusement, though only slightly. All the more reason for competent supervision. Severus's gaze slid toward Quirrell. The defense professor was applauding with the others, a weak smile flickering on his lips. Yet his eyes, when Severus caught them, dropped at once. Sweat gleamed at his temple despite the chill of the hall. That night, Severus made a slow circuit of the third-floor corridor after curfew. The Cerberus slept with all three heads piled against one another like ugly carved lions. The enchanted harp at its paws thrummed faintly, a residual vibration from Hagrid's playing earlier that evening. Severus checked the locks, the concealment charms, the hinge of the trapdoor. Everything remained intact. He had almost reached the stairs again when he heard a distant clatter, armor struck by a moving body somewhere below, and then the unmistakable scuffle of children running where no children ought to be. He stepped back into shadow. Filth's muttering drifted upward. Peeves gave a cackle of pure malice. Smaller footsteps rattled along a side passage, halted, changed direction. Severus began to move, swift and silent, and in the same instant, a fresh sound split the corridor behind him. Not childish panic now, but the ragged, furious barking of Fluffy jolted awake. Severus spun. The door stood ajar. For 1 second, every possibility struck him at once. Children. Quirrell. Some random idiot from Hufflepuff with a taste for dares. Then he was through the door, wand already in hand, and all three heads lunged in a storm of teeth and rank breath. He flung a stunning charm at the nearest snout and a binding charm at the forelegs. The creature roared, snapped, and its left head fastened briefly on the hem of his robes. He twisted free, saw at a glance that the trapdoor beneath the dog remained closed, and backed out before the beast's second lunge took his hand off at the wrist. The door slammed. Barking shook dust from the beams. Footsteps fled at the far end of the corridor. Not children. Too measured. Too fast. Severus swore once, softly, and with precision, and pursued. By the time he reached the turn near the unused music room, the passage was empty save for torchlight wavering over stone. Yet one dropped thing remained on the floor. A torn shred of dark fabric, cheap wool, snagged perhaps on a rusted bracket. Quirrell, Severus thought. Only Quirrell wore robes cut from cloth that thin. He stooped to retrieve it and felt then, not from the bite he had escaped but from some colder instinct, the shape of the year shifting beneath his feet. Halloween brought the troll, and with it the first foolish collision of children's courage, adult deception, and plain bad luck. Severus knew the moment the creature entered the castle that it had not wandered there by accident. Mountain trolls did not often oblige school tradition by choosing feast nights for their invasions. The hall had been ringing with chatter and candlelight. Then Quirrell burst through the doors, face bleached to paste beneath his turban, and stammered his warning before collapsing theatrically at the foot of the dais. "Troll," he gasped. "In the dungeons. Thought you ought to know." "No." Then he fainted. Students screamed. Benches scraped. Dumbledore stood, bellowed for prefects to shepherd their houses, and the hall exploded into motion. Severus had no business admiring the timing, yet on a purely strategic level it was efficient. Panic in the hall. Staff dispersed. Children driven into corridors and the dungeons where everyone assumed the troll to be, rendered suddenly inaccessible to most of the faculty who might have noticed an intruder moving elsewhere. He had begun already to turn toward the third floor when Quirrell opened his eyes. Only for an instant. Only enough for Severus, watching while the others shouted, to see clear consciousness there. Then the lids lowered again. Minerva ran with the students. Flitwick hurried after Ravenclaw. Sprout followed the Hufflepuffs. Dumbledore himself swept off with an authority that made chaos part around him. Severus did not go to the dungeons. He took the moving staircase 3 at a time, black robes snapping around his boots, and reached the third-floor corridor just in time to hear Fluffy's enraged thunder shaking the door. The lock hung blasted open. Someone had entered. Someone had survived long enough to retreat. He was through the door and checked by the beast again, though this time the left head lunged farther and caught him across the calf. Pain flared white. He drove the animal back with a curse sharp enough to crack stone at the hinge, dropped to one knee, and saw that the trapdoor was still closed, but the harp had been disturbed. A string hung broken. A novice attempt, clumsy and hurried. The would-be thief had not yet passed below, but there had been an attempt, and Quirrell had chosen exactly the right moment to scatter the school. When Severus returned, limping slightly, and with his jaw set hard enough to ache, the troll had been found not in the dungeons but on the first floor, where it had nearly bludgeoned 3 first-years to death in a girls' lavatory. By the time he arrived, McGonagall, Quirrell, and Dumbledore were already there. The troll lay senseless on the tiles with its own club in its hand. Hermione Granger looked tear-stained and shaken. Ronald Weasley was white with adrenaline. Harry Potter stared from one adult face to another with the dazed look of a boy who had not expected bravery to be quite so loud or so ugly. Dumbledore sent them off with less punishment than they deserved, which told Severus 2 things. First, that all 3 had likely performed some useful act in saving one another. Second, that Dumbledore's mind, like Severus's own, remained fixed on the more interesting part of the evening. Later, in the staff room, with Quirrell once more affecting tremors over a cup of tea he did not drink, Dumbledore's gaze dropped briefly to Severus's leg. "Fluffy objected to your visit," the headmaster said. "He objected to someone else's first." Quirrell looked up too quickly. "Someone else?" "Yes," said Severus, meeting the man's eyes at last. "A pity I did not catch him." The stammer returned in full, artful force. Surely no one would be mad enough. Surely. Quirrell's hand strayed to his turban. The garlic smell thickened the room. Across the school, however, the subtler war of inference had already begun. Children noticed what adults sometimes overlooked, if only because children had more time to devote to patterns born of imagination. Harry Potter saw Severus's injured leg at breakfast the next morning, and did not know about Fluffy or the failed attempt on the stone, though he knew enough to sense secrecy when it thickened the air around a teacher. He had seen the dog. He had seen Severus's hostility. He had now seen the bandage beneath the black hem. As far as Harry was concerned, the solution to the puzzle was obvious. From then on, Severus became in the boy's mind not merely unpleasant but suspicious. It should not have mattered. Children suspected their teachers of all sorts of nonsense. Yet the combination of Potter's famous courage, Weasley's willingness to support any reckless theory that involved rule-breaking, and Granger's intelligence made them more dangerous than other first years. They would not leave a mystery alone. They would prod it simply because it existed. By early November, Harry had overheard enough fragments to give shape to his conclusions. Hagrid said something by the fire about the dog guarding something. A library search produced nothing except frustration and a string of dead-end names. Draco Malfoy, shut out from the trio's growing conspiracies, lurked about with insult ready on the tongue and no useful insight at all. Hermione, with her curse of competence, began assembling facts no child ought to possess. Severus noticed them watching him. He noticed, too, Quirrell noticing. The first Quidditch match of the year arrived under low iron clouds, and wind sharp enough to flay exposed hands raw-doggy. The entire school swarmed to the stands in scarves and hats. Gryffindor sang until Slytherin drowned them out. Lee Jordan's commentary began before the teams had fully risen into the air and never thereafter approached objectivity. Severus took his seat among the staff and fastened his attention where it belonged, not on the game but on Harry Potter. The boy flew well. Better than well. He flew with the absorbed instinct of someone whose body understood what his mind had not yet learned to doubt. There was James in that too. Damn him, though stripped of the older Potter's showmanship. Harry's concentration burned forward and clean. He chased the snitch with a hunter's single-mindedness that would have been beautiful had the stakes been less complicated. Then the broom jerked. Not a natural wobble, not wind, not the ordinary bucking of a badly handled school broom. A twist, a drop, a savage wrench sideways. Severus's head snapped toward Quirrell. The defense professor sat hunched at the edge of his bench, lips moving, eyes fixed on Harry with such hungry intensity that for a heartbeat he looked nothing like the timid man who quailed before his own students. The stammer was gone. Whatever words he muttered came fast and smooth. Severus began the counter-curse at once. He kept his gaze on Harry, because any alert glance toward Quirrell would have warned the man off. The spell needed continuity. Once the jinx took hold, breaking it by force was more difficult than meeting it thread for thread. The broom dipped again. Harry slid, clinging with both hands. The crowd's roar changed to a single animal cry of alarm. "Come on," Severus said under his breath. Not to the boy, but to the spell itself, to the snarled knot of malice trying to fling an 11-year-old out of the sky. He countered one movement, then another. Sweat broke cold at the base of his spine. Quirrell's curse pressed harder. Somewhere near him a girl shouted. There was a violent jostle in the row behind. Then heat flared at the hem of his robes. Severus broke off with a hissed oath and leapt to his feet as orange fire licked upward. Students shrieked, thinking perhaps that the match itself had become part of the emergency. He stamped the flames out with furious efficiency, spun, and saw Hermione Granger on hands and knees, face white with guilt and determination in equal measure. In the few seconds of disruption, Harry's broom steadied. The boy shot upward, arms wrapped around the handle, then flattened himself and chased the snitch with even greater ferocity, perhaps from the mortal understanding that falling was possible now in a way it had not been 10 seconds earlier. He swallowed the snitch in the end, an indecorous maneuver Lee Jordan would later call genius and Minerva call indigestion waiting to happen. And Gryffindor's stands exploded. Around Severus, staff members shouted questions. "Your robes. Good heavens! Was that an accident? He ignored them all and looked instead at Granger, who had scrambled away into the crowd and was now staring at him with the harrowed expression of someone not yet certain whether she had just saved a life or very nearly ruined several. Interesting. By supper, the school had decided that the match's near disaster was either an ordinary sports mishap or proof that Harry Potter was too dramatic to remain on a broom without assistance from Providence. Children preferred stories that preserved their heroes. Adults preferred explanations that avoided institutional failure. Severus preferred facts. He found Quirrell that evening in an empty classroom on the second floor. The man stood at the window with both hands pressed to the sill, looking as though he had been very sick. When the door closed behind Severus, he jumped visibly. Severus. No stammer now? Severus asked. Quirrell attempted a smile. It faltered. You chose a public venue, Severus said. Bold? I don't know what you mean. Do not insult me. You had your eyes on Potter all afternoon. Your lips moving, your magic on his broom. An interesting choice of victim, unless of course your real object was not the boy. Quirrell's face seemed to loosen, then tighten again around some private strain. You see plots in shadows, and you place them there. For one flashing second, Severus thought the other man might cast. Something moved behind the eyes, something cold and ancient enough to make the room itself feel narrower. Then Quirrell's shoulders curved inward again. You should consider, Quirrell whispered, whether there are forces in this school you do not understand. Severus took one step closer. And you should consider whether I am more likely to let you steal from Dumbledore than I was to let a child die in front of the whole school. The air sharpened between them. Then from the corridor beyond came the faint scrape of a shoe and the collective intake of breath shared by people who think they are hiding and realize too late that they are not. Children died. Severus turned to the door. He reached it in 3 strides, yanked it open, and found the corridor empty except for a retreating glimpse of red hair vanishing round the corner. Potter, he thought at once. Potter, Weasley, Granger. Perfect. Now they had overheard only enough to be wrong with greater confidence. He stood in the doorway until the corridor stilled again. Behind him, Quirrell gave a thin laugh that held no amusement. Difficult, isn't it, he said, when one's allies are so very young? Severus shut the door with deliberate care and wondered, not for the first time, whether allowing the children to continue in ignorance would become more dangerous than telling them something they had no right to know. Dumbledore heard Severus out without interruption. That, in itself, was irritating. The headmaster stood by the long window in his circular office, hands linked behind his back, while silver instruments on the surrounding tables puffed and twirled in lazy clouds of steam. Fawkes watched from his perch with the insolent calm unique to creatures who either could not die or had already made peace with it. Beyond the glass, rain blurred the grounds and the black lake into a single dark sheet. They have decided I am the thief, Severus finished. And after this afternoon, they will also decide I attempted to extort Quirrell into sharing the prize. Dumbledore turned from the window. You are, I admit, not aided in these matters by a naturally reassuring manner. Severus did not dignify that with a response. The children are 11, Dumbledore went on. Their suspicions are not state secrets. No, their talent for walking into danger because they believe themselves right is the danger. Potter in particular will not leave this alone. Harry is brave. He is reckless. He is both. Severus's patience frayed. Quirrell used a troll to cover an attempt on the stone. He nearly murdered Potter on a broom in daylight. The children are already involved up to the neck and have attached themselves to the wrong enemy. Either we confine them so thoroughly they learn nothing, which you will not do, or we correct the most catastrophic of their assumptions. Dumbledore's fingers moved once against the back of his hand. You propose what? That I tell them enough. A pause. Enough, Dumbledore repeated softly, is a treacherous quantity. I know precisely how much I mean. Severus took a breath he did not need and hated that it felt like swallowing acid. I tell them I once served the Dark Lord. I tell them I no longer do. I tell them I answer to you and have for years. I tell them Quirrell, not I. Cursed Potter's broom. No more. Dumbledore's gaze sharpened in a way that made him suddenly look far older and far more dangerous. You are prepared for what Harry may think of you afterward. He thinks badly of me already. That is not what I asked. Severus said nothing. Because yes, he was prepared to be hated. He had long ago taken hatred into account in every useful relationship of his life. What he was not prepared for was the exact shape that hatred might take in Lily's son once it was joined to disgust. Dumbledore watched him a moment longer. Then he inclined his head. Very well, he said. Under my supervision. The summons went to 3 first years and caused, as such things always did, an evening of whispered speculation in Gryffindor Tower. Harry came to the appointed classroom with his shoulders squared as if to face execution. Ron came looking mutinous but loyal. Hermione came white-faced and bright-eyed, carrying fear like a lantern she was unwilling to extinguish because she preferred to see the thing frightening her. Dumbledore stood by the hearth. Severus stood near the desk. The room was empty of students and ordinary purpose. Only candlelight and rain filled its corners. Harry looked from one professor to the other. Professor McGonagall said you wanted to see us, sir. I did, said Dumbledore. Please, sit. They did not sit. Mr. Potter, Dumbledore said, Professor Snape has asked for my permission to correct a misunderstanding that has become, in his judgment and in mine, dangerous. Harry's gaze darted to Severus. He looked ready to object on principle. Severus spoke before he could. You believe I am attempting to steal what is hidden in this school? No one answered. Silence could be very loud when carried by children. You are wrong. Ron gave a tiny disbelieving snort. Hermione elbowed him so hard he winced. Severus went on. You also believe I attempted to kill Potter during the Quidditch match. This time Harry spoke. I saw you. You saw me countering a curse. The room still seemed to shrink around that sentence. Harry stared. What? What? Your broom was being jinxed. I was undoing it. That's not true, Ron burst out. Hermione saw you muttering and staring and... Miss Granger, said Severus, not taking his eyes from Harry. Also, set fire to my robes. Hermione made a strangled sound. Dumbledore's beard twitched very slightly. An action, I think, prompted by admirable if misdirected intent. Severus ignored that. The person cursing the broom was Professor Quirrell. 3 young faces stared at him, each in a different register of disbelief. Hermione's mind was clearly already racing ahead, recalculating months of evidence. Ron looked as though the floor had become unreliable beneath his feet. Harry simply looked furious. Why should we believe you? Because Dumbledore does. Because I have spent 11 years keeping promises no one but the dead remembers. Because the alternative is that I stood in a freezing stadium uttering protective magic for the pleasure of it. Instead, Severus said, because Headmaster Dumbledore would not be standing in this room if I were lying to you. Harry turned at once to Dumbledore. Sir? Dumbledore's eyes were steady. Professor Snape speaks the truth. The words landed and did not settle. Harry looked back to Severus, and all the anger in him seemed to harden into something colder. But why would Quirrell do that? That, said Severus, is not yours to know. It's my life. Yes, Severus said, and heard the crack in his own voice before he smothered it, which is precisely why you will stop meddling in matters you do not understand. Harry's chin came up. You don't understand either, if you think I'm just going to forget. Forget? The word slipped out sharper than he intended. No one asked you to forget. You may dislike me as much as you please, Potter. I do not require your affection. I require your obedience. Nani? Da. Ron bristled. Hermione's fingers closed on her sleeve. Harry's eyes blazed. And what if I don't give it? Severus held the gaze. There was James in the set of the mouth, James in the refusal to back down, but Lily in the steadiness. Lily, too, had looked at him as though truth ought to matter more than power. "Then you will most likely die," Severus said. "Or, if fate remains perversely charitable, someone else will die saving you from your own stupidity." The words struck harder than shouting would have. Hermione whispered, "Professor, are you saying Professor Quirrell is trying to get past the dog?" "Miss Granger," said Dumbledore gently, "I am saying that Professor Snape and I believe there are dangers in the castle which some of our staff are better suited to address than 3 first years." Ron frowned. "Then why tell us any of this at all?" "A sensible question," said Dumbledore. "Because," Severus said, "you have already involved yourselves. Because Potter listens at doors. Because Weasley follows him. Because Miss Granger, unfortunately for all of us, is clever enough to make bad instincts effective. You will now use those talents in one direction only. If you observe Quirrell behaving suspiciously, you will inform me or the headmaster at once. You will not follow him. You will not investigate alone. You will not attempt heroics." "Nundy, pile, pa." Harry laughed once, with no humor in it. "And we're just supposed to trust you." "Trust," Severus said, "is a sentimental word. Believe that I am trying to keep you alive. Beyond that, form whatever opinions amuse you." "None." The boy's face altered at that, not softened, but changed. He was remembering, perhaps, the falling broom, the muttering in the stands, the months of cold scrutiny from a man he had decided wanted him humiliated and hurt. Now the pattern no longer fit, and children hated nothing so much as the collapse of a simple moral story. "Why?" Harry asked at last. There it was. The one question Severus had known would come, though not perhaps so plainly, or so soon. He could have lied. He could have said duty, which would have been true and incomplete. He could have said Dumbledore, which would have been obvious. He could have said because I owe a debt that can never be paid, and the boy would not have understood. Instead, he said, because I choose to. Harry looked dissatisfied enough to spit. Good. Better dissatisfaction than knowledge. Dumbledore stepped in before the silence thickened further. This conversation remains in this room. You will speak of it to no one. Not Mr. Hagrid, not Miss McGonagall, not your housemates, and certainly not Professor Quirrell. Do I have your word? Hermione answered first, immediate and earnest. Yes, Professor. Ron, after a glance at Harry, muttered, All right. Harry did not speak for 3 full seconds. Then, without breaking eye contact with Severus, he said, Fine. It was the sort of answer that promised future trouble. When they had gone, the classroom seemed abruptly colder. Dumbledore sank into a chair by the fire, folded his hands over his stomach, and studied Severus with maddening calm. You handled that, he said, with almost no grace at all. I was not aware grace was the point. No. Duh. The point, I suspect, was avoiding the temptation to hex Mr. Potter into next week. Severus turned away. He had an unreasonable wish to smash every candle in the room. He wanted reasons. Children do. He cannot have that one. No. Dumbledore's voice gentled. Not yet. Severus said nothing. There were nights when he resented Dumbledore with a fatigue so old it had worn smooth. The old man asked for endurance as though it were a common household item, as though a promise made in grief could be drawn upon forever without cost. At length Dumbledore said, You have made the path more difficult. I know, but perhaps also safer. Severus laughed once under his breath. In this school, those are often the same thing. In Gryffindor Tower, the aftermath was less philosophical. Ron paced in front of the fire, all arms and righteous bewilderment. He was a Death Eater, he said for the 5th time, as though repetition might force the fact to become less obscene. An actual Death Eater. Hermione sat hunched on the edge of a chair, fingers pressed to her mouth. But Professor Dumbledore trusts him. So Professor Dumbledore doesn't trust the wrong people. Ron gave her a look of deep skepticism. Percy trusts the wrong people. Mum trusts the wrong people. Fred and George trust absolutely nobody, which is probably healthier. Why should Dumbledore be different? Harry stood by the window, forehead against the cold glass, looking down at the dark grounds. Somewhere out there, Hagrid's hut shone dim and gold. Beyond it, the forest pressed against the school like a thought best left unthought. He said Quirrell did it, Harry said. Hermione nodded. And that part fits. He was the one who let in the troll. Snape was injured the same night. If Quirrell tried to get past the dog, he was still a Death Eater, Ron said stubbornly. Harry turned. The firelight carved hollows beneath his eyes. I know. There was disgust in him, yes, and not only because of the word. He had grown up starved of stories that belonged to him. Now each one he acquired seemed rotten in the middle. Wizards had spoken his parents' names with awe. Hagrid had spoken Dumbledore's with warmth. Snape's name had come wrapped in schoolboy dread and adult silence. And all at once Harry knew that the nasty professor who bullied Neville and sneered at everyone had once stood on the side of the man who had killed his parents. And yet that same man had kept him from falling 50 feet to his death. The contradiction sat in Harry like a swallowed stone. What do we do? Hermione asked quietly. Harry looked back toward the window, toward the black grass and distant trees, and the unseen tower where Quirrell slept or schemed or both. We watch, he said. Down in his quarters, Severus stood at his own narrow window and had, at almost the same moment, precisely the same thought. The change in the children was not dramatic enough for anyone outside the problem to notice. That was one reason Severus trusted children so little. They transformed in increments, storing up convictions and resentments in silence until one day they acted in adults, taken by surprise, called the act sudden. Potter no longer glared openly at him in class, which was not the same thing as liking him. Weasley had not ceased to mutter whenever Severus passed within earshot, but the mutters had grown cautious. Granger watched Quirrell now with the sharp fixed attention she had once devoted to him. Quirrell noticed it too. One late afternoon, as students tramped out of defense against the dark arts, chattering over examination of red caps and the relative stupidity of practical work compared to theory, Quirrell paused in the corridor and let the line pass him. His eyes drifted, only drifted, across the retreating backs of Potter, Weasley, and Granger. Your little audience has become selective, he murmured. Severus, who had been waiting precisely for such an opening, said, Children mature. Some even learn where the danger lies. Quirrell's mouth twitched. Do they? Do you? The other man's face briefly emptied, as if something behind it had looked outward and found the mask too flimsy. We shall see, he said, and walked away in a rustle of cheap cloth and stale garlic. The library became for the trio less an adventure and more a campaign. Hermione attacked the problem of the guarded object with methodical fury. She had already ruled out entire shelves of titles by subject and probable relevance. Now she began charting names overheard from Hagrid, words caught in staff room drift, obscure references in the margins of alchemy texts old enough to crumble at the touch. Ron assisted under protest and with little precision. Harry, who had neither Hermione's patience nor Ron's gift for grumbling while remaining somehow useful, wandered between helping and staring into the middle distance. He was thinking of Snape. He did not wish to think of Snape. The man remained cruel in class. He still humiliated students for errors that would have earned only dry correction from McGonagall or Sprout. He still looked at Harry sometimes with such naked dislike that every rational adjustment Harry had tried to make shrank before it. But there had been moments since the revelation that would not align with simple hatred. Twice Harry had caught Quirrell near him in a corridor, and within moments seen Snape appear from some side passage or stare like a conjured warning. Once, when Seamus Finnegan jostled Harry hard outside Charms and sent his book sprawling, Snape himself had stooped, not gracefully, not kindly, but unmistakably, to seize one rolling volume before it slid down the moving staircase. He had thrust it back into Harry's hands with a disgusted curl of lip and said, Do try not to die of clumsiness in common areas, Potter. It creates paperwork." Harry had stood there with the book in his hand long after Snape's robes vanished. Hermione noticed all of this, naturally. "He's worse to you when Quirrell's around," she said one evening in the library, eyes still on the page she was skimming. "I think he's doing it on purpose." Ron looked up from an upside-down copy of Great Wizarding Events of the 20th Century. "Being horrible on purpose?" "Yes." "Why?" "To make it look normal," Harry said before he could stop himself. They both looked at him. He shrugged and hated that he felt defensive. "If Quirrell thinks Snape hates me, then maybe he doesn't wonder why Snape keeps turning up." Hermione closed the book slowly. "That... awful," said Ron. "Complicated," she said. Harry snorted. "Same thing, probably." Christmas came down over the castle in a hush of snow and candlelight. Corridors glowed with holly and bewitched frost. The suits of armor wore evergreen wreaths tied by fifth years with more enthusiasm than symmetry. Great logs burned in common room hearths. Those students not going home sank into a temporary intimacy made of fewer voices, longer meals, and the peculiar melancholy that haunted schools when most of the children had gone. Harry stayed, of course. The Dursleys had made clear enough that his absence would be considered a holiday blessing. Ron stayed too because one of his brothers was in Romania and another in Egypt, and Molly Weasley, practical to the bone, had decided she could not assemble the whole family this year, and therefore might as well divide and conquer. Hermione went home with enough homework to stagger under, and promises to return before term with more information than either of the boys could possibly want. On Christmas morning, Harry found, beneath a pile of practical presents, a folded square of silver cloth that shimmered when he shook it out. There was a note pinned to it in no handwriting he recognized. "Your father left this in my possession before he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well." No signature. Harry knew almost at once what it must be. Every child at Hogwarts knew stories of invisibility cloaks, though most treated them as fairy tale relics or objects for elaborate cheating. When he threw it over himself and vanished from sight, his heart gave a fierce jump that was half delight and half grief. His father's cloak. Dim. Something that had belonged to James Potter had been held, worn, perhaps laughed in. Something that had passed through his mother's hands too, maybe. That night, while Ron snored like an obstructed badger in the four-poster beside his, Harry took the cloak and went out into the castle. The first thrill of unseen wandering made the school feel newly made. Portraits muttered in their sleep. Moonlight silvered the floors and stair rails. Firelight leaked beneath doors and vanished as he moved. He stood for several smug minutes in the staff room alcove listening to Snape and McGonagall dispute Quidditch fouls from matches 3 years past, then escaped before he laughed and gave himself away. He slipped into the library's restricted section with a lantern and every intention of finding something, anything, about the mysterious object beyond Fluffy. The books there were less books than warnings bound in hide. Some screamed when opened. Some leaked greenish fumes. One contained a picture that looked too much like a real eye and appeared to watch him from every page. Harry, rattled but determined, dragged out a massive black volume and opened it on a stand. A horrible, piercing wail tore through the aisle. He slammed the book shut so hard the lantern rattled. Footsteps sounded almost at once beyond the shelves. Filch's muttering voice. Another step. Lighter, quicker, decisive. Snape. Harry snatched up the book, nearly dropped it, shoved it back anyway up, threw the cloak over himself, and flattened against the shelving just as Severus swept into the aisle like a blade. "Who is there?" he said softly. Filch lumbered behind him carrying a lamp. "Peas, I'll warrant. Thought I heard the little swine on this floor earlier." "No." "One word." "Certain." Severus stood very still. Harry scarcely dared breathe. The cloak hid him, but he could not silence the pounding of his own blood. Snape's head turned slightly. Not toward him exactly, but toward the awareness of him. The place in the air where presence was wrong. For one impossible instant, Harry thought Snape knew. Go, Severus said without raising his voice. Filch blinked. What? I said go. This was no poltergeist. It was a book alarm. Some idiot student seeking glory in volumes beyond his level. I will handle it. Filch grumbled, but shuffled off. Severus remained. Then, into the seemingly empty aisle, he said, "Whoever you are, understand this. Curiosity is not the same thing as courage. The library is less forgiving than the house points ledger, and some books prefer blood to fingerprints. Me." He waited a beat. "Return to your dormitory." Then he turned and left. Harry remained rooted in place long after the footsteps faded. The warning had been general enough to preserve plausible deniability. Yet Harry had the absurd conviction that Snape had spoken directly to him through cloth and darkness, having guessed without proof and chosen not to expose him. He did go back to the tower that night. He went out again the next. And the night after that, he found the mirror. It stood in an abandoned classroom among stacked desks and covered chairs, taller than any mirror had a right to be, framed in gold tarnished almost black. At the top were words Harry could not at once read. It reflected him clearly enough, a small dark-haired boy in pajamas and a borrowed cloak. But behind him, when he stepped closer, stood a crowd. His mother's hair shone like living copper. His father's hand rested lightly on her shoulder. There were others too, relatives perhaps, all with the same impossible warmth in their faces. They did not move exactly, yet they seemed more present than portraits, more real than dreams. Harry reached back without thinking. His hand met only cold air. He returned the next night, and the next. He stopped thinking about Nicolas Flamel. He stopped for a while, thinking about Quirrell, and the stone and the strange adult war unfolding around him. The mirror hollowed out time and filled it with longing. Here at last were the faces he had never seen, except in Hagrid's photograph album, and even that album had shown stillness, not this aching sense of almost presence. If he stayed long enough, perhaps they would speak. If he reached cleverly enough, perhaps the glass would give. On the fourth night, a voice behind him said, "It does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live." Harry spun. Dumbledore sat on one of the abandoned desks, robes spilling silver blue in the moonlight as if he had always been part of the room's stillness. He had not heard him enter. "Sir, I didn't see you." "No," said Dumbledore. "Such is the benefit of age. One acquires a certain stealth." Harry looked back at the mirror. "What is it?" "The mirror of your eyes." Dumbledore watched the gold frame reflect candleless light. "It shows us nothing more or less than the deepest, most desperate desire of our hearts." Harry swallowed. "I'm seeing my family." "Yes? What do you see?" Dumbledore's eyes glinted. "Socks," he said mildly, and Harry knew, even at 11, that he was being handled. Dumbledore rose and laid one hand against the frame. "Men have wasted away before this mirror, Mr. Potter. Others have gone mad. It will be moved tomorrow. I ask you not to go looking for it." "Nay, nay." Harry nodded because anything else in the presence of those calm old eyes felt impossible. But later, leaving the room at last with the cloak clutched in one fist, he turned a corner and found Snape standing in the corridor as though made of the wall itself. Harry stopped dead. Snape's gaze flicked to the cloak in his hand, then to his face. He looked, for one naked second, not angry but tired. "Back to bed," he said. Harry opened his mouth, perhaps to lie, perhaps to defend himself. Snape cut him off. "Whatever you were looking for out here after midnight, it is less likely to fill the hole you imagine than to widen it." The words hit with strange force. Harry felt heat rise behind his eyes and hated it. "That's none of your business," he muttered. "No," Snape said. "Unfortunately it is." He stepped aside to let Harry pass. The boy hesitated. "You knew?" "Mr. Potter, there are not many first years in this castle foolish enough to wander the corridors on Christmas week under invisible cloth, while haunted enough to ignore the sound of my footsteps." Harry stared at him. "You could have taken it off me." Yes, said Snape, and you would have learned absolutely nothing useful from the humiliation. He turned away. His robes whispered over the stone. Go to bed, Potter. Harry did. He lay awake for a long time afterward, staring into the dark hangings around his bed, and thinking that there might be whole countries hidden inside a single sentence from Severus Snape, all of them hostile, several of them truthful, and none safe to walk through barefoot. Hermione returned in January with frost on her cloak and triumph in both hands. I found him, she announced before she was properly through the portrait hole. Well, not him exactly, because he's centuries old, and that would be difficult, but I've found the name. Ron looked up from a game of wizard chess he was losing to himself. You found who? Nicolas Flamel. The name dropped into the room like a coin into deep water. Harry shut the essay he had been pretending to write. Within minutes, the three of them had claimed a corner near the fire and spread out Hermione's notes, copied in neat lines so dense they looked like the work of a benign maniac. Nicolas Flamel, alchemist, creator of the Philosopher's Stone, one known to have produced the elixir of life. 600 years old and still alive if one believed the most recent records. The stone could turn metal to gold and make one immortal, at least so long as the supply lasted. Harry sat back. So that's what Fluffy is guarding. Ron whistled low. No wonder, Snape. He stopped. Hermione watched Harry carefully. They did not say Quirrell's name loudly now if they could avoid it. It felt too much like whistling for something in the dark. He wants the stone, Harry said. Yes, said Hermione. And if Professor Snape's right, that's why he tried to get past the dog. Harry stared into the fire. He remembered Hagrid on the first train ride, big hands gentle around the teacups, saying there was no safer place than Hogwarts when Dumbledore wanted something kept. He remembered Quirrell's pale face and trembling hands. He remembered Snape's voice like a knife saying, then you will most likely die. What would he do with it? Ron asked. No one answered at once. Outside the windows, snow fell in slow, thick drifts against the dark. The castle seemed sealed from the world, warm at the core. Yet Harry had begun to understand that walls did not keep danger out if danger had already been invited in and given a staff bedroom. On the same evening, some distance below, Quirrell stood alone in his rooms with the fire burned down to embers. The room smelled of herbs meant to disguise other things. The curtains were drawn despite the hour not being late. Books lay open on every surface. Theories of protective enchantment, histories of alchemical concealment, speculative text on mirrors, desire, and extraction magic. Quirrell had tried several approaches already and failed. The enchantments around the stone were not crude, and Dumbledore's mind was built of infuriating loops and kindnesses that hid steel underneath. He stood before the hearth and pressed his palm to the side of his head where cloth and skin and another presence met. I am trying, he whispered. The answer came not in sound exactly, but in pressure behind the eyes, a hiss of thought that seemed to rise through marrow rather than air. You are hesitating. I am watched. A pulse of cold contempt. By a schoolmaster. By children. By Severus, Quirrell said, and could not keep a note of fear out of the name. He suspects. He suspects because you are weak. Quirrell shut his eyes. He had not been weak once. Not entirely. He had left Britain hungry for knowledge, for proof that the world's locked doors could be opened if one dared the right spells and the wrong places. In Albania he had found neither glory nor wisdom, only shadows, blood in the roots of trees, and a voice that promised greatness while fastening around his will like wire. Yet the promise remained. Power. Restoration. Purpose larger than a timid scholar's life of chalk and chalkboards. The children have changed, he said. Potter no longer fears Severus most. Then adjust, said the voice. Quirrell opened his eyes to the dead red center of the fire. He was so tired. His sleep came in jagged pieces now, haunted by dreams that were not entirely his own. His skin beneath the turban felt colder every day, as though something parasitic and ancient had chosen him for a winter tree. Adjust, the voice repeated, or be discarded. Meanwhile, Harry, Ron, and Hermione made the sort of practical decision that all great crises eventually produce in children. They took their discoveries to Hagrid. Not all of them. They did not mention Snape's confession. That remained private because Dumbledore had ordered it so, and because, if Harry was honest, he could not bear the thought of Hagrid's face if he learned that the nasty potions master had once been a Death Eater. The giant-hearted gamekeeper's world did not admit many gray places. Harry wanted at least one adult around him to stay simple. Hagrid, however, had never been built for secrecy. One mention of Nicolas Flamel and the stone produced from him exactly the startled silence they had hoped for, followed by so much huffing and beard-tugging that Hermione nearly glowed. "I knew it," she breathed once they were on the hut's path afterward. He didn't even deny it. He nearly swallowed his own beard, Ron agreed happily. Harry looked back at the lit window. If Hagrid knows that much, Quirrell might try getting at him. The thought settled badly among them. It settled worse with Severus when he reached the same conclusion independently. Hagrid's innocence was not a weakness in the ordinary sense. It was a structural fact of his character, a kind of moral enormity that made him loyal and dangerous in equal measure. He loved too quickly, pitied too easily, and responded to flattery with a trust that would have been touching in anyone not responsible for creatures with tusks. Severus found him one evening feeding bloody strips of meat to something snarling behind a crate in the hut. The windows were shut, but enough sound escaped to suggest Hagrid had somehow acquired an animal that ought to have required a ministry permit, a fortified paddock, and perhaps a last will. Hagrid started so violently the knife in his hand clanged against the table. "Blimey, Professor! Don't creep up like that." "Nah. A difficult request," said Severus, eyeing the crate. "Given that you spend your evenings smuggling endangered disaster into school grounds." Hagrid puffed out his beard. "Ain't endangered. Yet." The crate snapped from within. Severus pinched the bridge of his nose. "You are not fit to keep teacups, let alone whatever infernal thing that is. Listen carefully. If anyone, student, staff member, stranger in a cloak, charming traveler with an interest in magical creatures, questions you about the dog on the 3rd floor, you are to tell them nothing." Hagrid's eyes widened. "Who's been asking? Has someone?" "Course not," Hagrid said far too quickly. Severus stared until the gamekeeper squirmed. "Do not lie to me. You are spectacularly bad at it." Hagrid muttered something into his beard. The crate sneezed sparks between the slats. "Someone asked?" Severus said softly. "It weren't like that." "What was it like?" Hagrid hesitated. Just talk, yay? Friendly-like. Over cards down in the village, didn't know who it was proper. Cloak up, voice funny. Asked about creatures mostly, asked how he'd get past a dog like Fluffy. I didn't tell him nothing important." Severus closed his eyes. "Hagrid. Only said he likes music, didn't I? Anyone could tell that from spending 5 minutes with him. Big softy once you know the tune." The silence that followed was so absolute that even the thing in the crate quieted. Hagrid's face fell. "That's bad, is it?" Severus looked at him and understood with bleak clarity why Dumbledore loved fools. They broke one's heart so completely that anger became almost decorative. "Yes," he said. "It is very bad." The walk back to the castle felt longer than usual. Snow crunched under his boots. From the grounds rose the clean, bitter smell of winter and the distant roar of the lake striking ice. Somewhere high above, children laughed in a tower. Life went on. Lessons would begin again at 9 o'clock. Longbottom would melt something. Peeves would assault a suit of armor with ink. And beneath all of that, like a blade under cloth, the line of attack had just become simpler. He cut through a side corridor toward the dungeon stairs and nearly ran into Hermione Granger. She stopped short, clutching an armful of books to her chest. In her face he read guilt, fear, and a determination almost as old-looking as his own. "Professor, Miss Granger." She swallowed. "I wasn't doing anything. Your generation's most persistent lie." Color rose in her cheeks. "I just came from the library." So I infer from the books. How observant of me. Nah. She hesitated, then said in a rush, Professor, if we notice anything about Professor Quirrell, we tell you, don't we? Severus regarded her. Yes. Not Professor McGonagall. If it concerns Quirrell, me. Something flickered in her eyes. Relief, oddly enough. Perhaps because commands, however unpleasant, were easier to bear than helplessness. All right, she said. He might have let her go. Instead, he heard himself add, Miss Granger, this is not a puzzle set for bright children to solve between homework assignments. Her chin lifted. I know that. No, dot. You know the words for it. That is different. Nanun. And tea. She opened her mouth, closed it, and finally gave a tiny nod. As she hurried away, Severus thought that of the three, she was the one most likely to understand eventually why adults lied by omission. Not to forgive it. Perhaps not ever to forgive it, but to understand. The dragon, when it hatched, was almost enough to derail the rest of the year. Only Hagrid could look upon a newly hatched Norwegian ridgeback, spines like broken glass, jaws already smoking, temper appalling, and see a little beauty. The creature bit, scorched, howled, shredded blankets, chewed furniture, and grew at a rate suggesting it had made some private contract with time. Harry and Hermione, appalled, argued. Ron, whose hand was bitten in a moment of misplaced optimism, argued less after the first swelling set in. Malfoy, naturally, discovered the secret. He saw enough through one of Hagrid's windows to know the trio were involved in something forbidden, and from that point forward wore the expression of a boy who has found currency and intends to spend it extravagantly. The consequences: nighttime scheming, messages to Charlie Weasley in Romania, an illicit transfer atop the astronomy tower, unwound toward disaster with a sort of inevitability peculiar to plans made by children at midnight. McGonagall caught them, not at the dragon itself, which had been packed off in a crate on the back of friends and good luck, but in the aftermath, when exhaustion and triumph had made them careless. They lost more house points than Gryffindor thought survivable. Harry, once briefly heroic, became in his house estimation a traitor to the common cause. Ron went with him by association. Hermione, who bore public disapproval like a physical pain, went nearly gray with it. Severus, hearing of the punishment, felt only weary vindication. Detention on school grounds would have been sufficient. Minerva, wounded in her sense of order and not above making examples, sent them into the Forbidden Forest. He sought her out before the sentence was carried out. The forest? He said. McGonagall looked up from a stack of essays. I trust Hagrid with them. Hagrid trusts blast-ended ideas. That is not the same as safety. It will be after dark, not after Armageddon. There is something in the forest. She frowned. There is always something in the forest. This is new. He did not tell her why he knew. Quirrell's failures had made him bold. The stone remained out of reach. Unicorns had begun turning up slaughtered. McGonagall, practical as iron, crossed her arms. If you know something relevant, say it plainly. Severus met her eyes. I know enough to dislike any plan that places Potter under trees where killing curses leave no marks on stone walls. Something in his face must have carried farther than the words, because her own expression altered. For a second she looked not at a colleague but at a man holding himself together by old habits. I will speak to Hagrid, she said more quietly. It made no difference. Hagrid assured everyone he would keep the students close. Then he found the silvery blood almost at once, and with the insane field judgment of one who had been raised among giants and dragons, split the group. Harry went one way with Draco Malfoy and Fang. Neville and Hagrid took another. The forest gathered around them like a living cathedral made of bark and damp. Moonlight broke in shards on leaves slick with cold. Somewhere far off, something cried in a voice too human to be comfortable. At first, Harry tried to be brave because Malfoy was there, and because Hagrid had looked at him with special earnestness before disappearing among the trunks. But bravery in the forest did not feel like bravery on a broom, or before a troll. It felt thin. The dark was not passive. It listened. It pressed inward. Fang growled low. Malfoy whispered a curse and drew closer without meaning to. They found the unicorn in a clearing washed silver. It lay on its side among the roots of an old beech, the body white as frost and ruined at the throat. Blood shone on the dead leaves with a brightness that made Harry's skin prickle. The creature looked too pure to be dead at all, too untouched by ordinary life ever to have been entered by death. Yet it was there, unmistakable, and from the wound a dark shape was bent, drinking. Harry's scar split with pain. He cried out and clapped a hand to his forehead. The hooded figure lifted its head. The face beneath the cowl was shadow, or perhaps no face at all, but the movement conveyed such naked hunger that Harry's stomach turned. Then it came at him. Malfoy screamed and bolted. Fang yelped and fled after him. Harry stumbled back, scar blazing so viciously he could scarcely see. The figure moved with terrifying purpose, not running exactly but gliding between the trees, as if the darkness itself bore it. A thunder of hooves shattered the moment. Something pale and immense reared between Harry and the hooded thing. The figure hissed, not from a human throat, and retreated into the black. Harry collapsed against a root, breath tearing at his lungs. The centaur turned its great head. His hair shone pale as moonlit wheat. His body seemed carved out of night and light together. "Are you all right?" Harry nodded, though he was plainly not. The centaur lowered himself slightly. "You are the Potter boy. How do you know?" "The forest knows," said the centaur. "And Mars has been bright tonight." Harry pressed his burning scar. What was that? The centaur's nostrils flared. A creature that has lost the right to call itself whole. Another centaur crashed through the trees moments later, dark and wild-eyed, and there followed a brief, furious exchange in a language of resentment Harry scarcely understood. He caught only fragments, planetary omens, the folly of interference, the danger of naming what should be inferred. The pale centaur ignored most of it. At last he bent toward Harry again. "Unicorn blood will keep a person alive," he said, "but at a terrible price. You have slain something pure to save yourself, and will have only a half-life, a cursed life, from the moment the blood touches your lips." Harry whispered, "Who'd do that?" The centaur's eyes were ancient and full of sorrow. "Can you think of no one?" The answer rose before Harry could stop it. "Voldemort?" Even the forest seemed to flinch. By the time Hagrid found them and hurried Harry back to the castle with one hand gripping his shoulder, as though he feared the child might otherwise float away, Harry's fear had taken on a new shape. It was no longer vague. It had a name, and that name had once murdered his parents, and perhaps still moved through the world thin as smoke. He did not go first to bed. He went to Snape. The potions master had just left the dungeon classroom after an evening of marking when Harry came at him from the corridor, pale as wax, Hagrid's mud still on his hem, and scarlet light from the sconces catching the whites of his eyes. "Professor." Severus turned, irritation ready on his tongue. It vanished. "Potter, Torty." Harry looked as though he had been skinned on the inside. "I saw something in the forest," Hagrid said. "You should know. My scar, it hurt when it looked at me." Severus's hand tightened on the roll of essays he carried. "What did you see?" "In broken pieces with more honesty than usual because terror had stripped him of pride," Harry told him. "The dead unicorn. The hooded figure drinking. The pain. The centaur. The name he had spoken." Severus did not interrupt once. When Harry finished, the dungeon corridor felt suddenly too small to contain the silence. Then Severus said, "Come." He led Harry not to the tower but to the hospital wing, where Madame Pomfrey clucked over the boy's obvious shock and Hagrid's opinion that warm tea cured every affliction short of decapitation. Once Harry had been bullied into a bed and covered with 2 blankets he did not want. Severus turned on his heel and went straight to Dumbledore. The headmaster opened his office door before he knocked. "You have heard." Severus stepped inside. He used the forest. The fool used the forest because he could not breach the protections fast enough. Dumbledore's face had gone grave in a way students almost never saw. And Harry? Frightened, which in this case may serve him. And Quirrell? Desperate, Severus said. More than before. The children know enough now to feel the shape of it. Potter said his scar hurt. Dumbledore was silent for a moment. At times, he said at last, there are connections we do not yet understand. Severus laughed with no mirth. You must be exhausted, Albus. That was almost a straight answer. Dumbledore looked up sharply. Severus? I know. The anger went out of him as quickly as it had come, leaving only tiredness. But we are losing space. Hagrid has spoken. Potter has seen. Quirrell is being driven harder. Yes. He will move soon. Dumbledore's hand settled on the back of his chair. Then we must be ready. In the hospital wing, Harry lay awake staring at the canopy overhead. Long after Pomfrey had left and the lamps were dimmed, he heard footsteps. Snape came to the side of the bed, looked down at him for a moment, and placed a small stoppered vial on the bedside table. For the headache, he said. Harry's hand went unconsciously to his scar. What was it? He whispered. Snape's face was half shadow. Something that should have stayed dead. Then he turned and went out, and Harry, after a long time, drank the potion and slept without dreaming. The days before examinations were always ugly in Hogwarts. Ink stains spread like battle wounds. Sleeplessness made tempers short. The library became a siege engine built of anxious children and reference texts. Even Peeves lowered his volume in deference to the general air of desperation, though only because he found silent sabotage artistically refreshing. This year, however, ordinary school dread had a second pulse beneath it. Harry tried to revise. He truly did. Hermione drilled him on wand movement precision and the 12 uses of dragon blood. Ron read aloud from their notes until he lost his place and invented facts with such conviction that Harry nearly believed salamanders could be used to polish cauldrons. Yet, at the back of every hour sat the knowledge of what Hagrid had admitted and what the forest had confirmed. Quirrell wanted the stone. He now knew how to get past Fluffy. Somewhere in the castle, the mirror Dumbledore had moved now stood with the stone hidden by enchantment. Only the headmaster fully understood. Snape saw the tension in them and hated that he had no time to spare for softness, even if softness had ever come naturally. Potter looked too often toward doors. Weasley jumped at harmless noises. Granger had begun making lists in the margins of her notes, then scratching them out before anyone saw. At breakfast 3 mornings before the last exam, Hagrid let the fatal details slip. He meant no harm. He never meant harm. He only sat his great shaggy self at the staff table for a moment to speak with Dumbledore and, seeing Harry, smiled in what he likely believed an encouraging fashion. Harry, still not practiced in hiding his face, looked at him with immediate alarm. Hagrid's own expression shifted in response. Guilt before caution, and that, absurdly, told Hermione more than any confession could have done. By lunchtime, she had dragged Harry and Ron into an empty classroom. He knows, she said. Who? Hagrid. Or Quirrell. One of them knows something happened. Hagrid keeps looking as if he's swallowed a toad. Ron rubbed his face. Maybe he swallowed a toad. He probably keeps some. Harry shook his head. No, duh. It's because of the dragon. He told whoever gave him the egg how to get past Fluffy. Money. The words dropped heavy between them. Hermione went very still. Then Quirrell can get through tonight. Or any night, said Ron. No, Harry said. Tonight. He did not know why he was certain. Perhaps because fear ripens into certainty whether or not reason supports it. Perhaps because all crises seem to declare themselves imminent once one is tired enough. Or perhaps because some half-felt line tied Quirrell's desperation to the end of term, to the examinations that occupied everyone else, to the perfect moment when the school's attention turned inward. Then we tell Snape, Hermione said at once. They found him not in the dungeons but on the staircase outside the staff room. moving fast enough that his robes snapped behind him like whips. Harry called, "Professor!" Severus stopped. Something in his face made all three of them colder. He had the look of a man already holding too many thoughts at once. "What is it?" Harry spoke in a rush. Hagrid told someone months ago how to get past Fluffy. He thought it was just about dogs, but it was a stranger in a cloak, and now Quirrell knows. And if he tries tonight? "I know," Severus said. Hermione blinked. "You know?" "I know Hagrid talked." His mouth thinned. "And I know Dumbledore has just received an urgent message from the Ministry requiring his presence." Ron stared. "What? Why?" "Because whoever wants the stone prefers the headmaster elsewhere." Even Harry felt his skin go cold at the bluntness of that. Severus looked from one child to the next. "You will go back to your common room after supper and remain there. Do not leave it for any reason short of the castle burning down around your ears." "Professor," Hermione began. "No. But if Quirrell is my concern." Harry stepped forward. "Not if Dumbledore's gone." Severus's gaze fixed on him with sudden, terrible focus. "Mr. Potter, the degree to which you do not yet understand the difference between concern and responsibility continues to amaze me. Go. Upstairs. Stay there." Then he turned and strode away before Harry could answer. The desire to obey lasted perhaps an hour. Dumbledore left before sunset, his expression unreadable, robes sweeping. McGonagall supervised supper with the brittle energy of someone who had too much to do and too few staff not currently deranged by end-of-term chaos. Quirrell did not appear at table at all. Hagrid was nowhere visible. The castle seemed to thrum with ordinary life around a hollow center. Harry lasted through pudding. Then he leaned across the Gryffindor table and whispered, "He's already gone." Ron's ears turned red. "Harry, he's gone," Harry repeated. "Snape went after him, and if Quirrell gets past them both." Hermione gripped her fork so tightly her knuckles whitened. "Professor Snape told us not to. Professor Snape also told us someone would die if we got this wrong. That was to stop us meddling." "Yes," Harry hissed. "And it nearly worked." They stared at him. Around them the hall rang with talk of exam questions and summer plans. Someone at the Hufflepuff table laughed so loudly it startled an owl in the rafters. Hermione looked at Ron. Ron looked at Harry. The old shape reasserted itself, the dangerous one. 3 first years making a decision no child should have to make and making it anyway, because they were there and grown people were not. "All right," Ron muttered. "But if we die, I'm haunting you specifically." Hermione shut her eyes. "Fine." Under the cloak, the corridors after curfew seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the castle itself. The stones held daytime warmth in places and damp in others. Portraits dozed. Suits of armor gleamed like patient ghosts. Once, at a turn near the second floor, they heard McGonagall's voice from a classroom and flattened against the wall until she passed without seeing them. The third-floor corridor lay dark ahead. Fluffy slept beyond the door. Harry could hear the thunder of his breathing even through the wood. "What if Snape's already gone through?" Ron whispered. Hermione touched the handle. No luck. Harry's scar prickled. They slipped inside. The dog lay sprawled enormous in the half-light, all 3 heads drooping, a harp by his paws playing itself in thin, enchanted notes. One of the heads snored. Another twitched. "Quirrell must have used music," Hermione breathed. Harry looked at the trapdoor. It stood open. For 1 second, none of them moved. Then Harry said, "We're too late." A voice from behind them said, "Yes, you are." They whirled. Severus stood in the doorway, wand drawn, black against the corridor darkness. Fury lifted the air around him like heat. Harry's heart plunged. "Professor, we came because direct instruction in this school apparently functions as a decorative suggestion." Severus advanced 1 step. "Have you developed a death wish as a group, or do you take turns?" "We thought Quirrell," Hermione began. "Quirrell has already gone below," said Severus. which makes your presence here not merely disobedient but catastrophically late. Harry looked at the open trapdoor. Then we have to stop him. Weh, Severus said very softly. Means me. You will return to... A sound rose from beneath them. Not music now. A metallic crash far below, followed by a muffled shout that might have been pain or triumph. Harry met Snape's eyes and, for the first time all year, did not see merely dislike there. He saw calculation fighting fear. "Professor," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "If the stone's protected by spells and challenges, you might need us. Hermione's better at some things than anyone. Ron's chess is brilliant. I can fly. You know that." The words were reckless. They were also infuriatingly true. Severus's face closed like a trap. "If I permit this, you do exactly as I say. One command disobeyed, and I will drag you back by your ankles myself. Do you understand?" "No." "Gah." 3 heads nodded. "Good," he said. "Potter first." Harry did not think Severus meant it symbolically. He meant it because the boy was lightest and the least likely to crush whoever landed beneath. Still, as Harry swung himself down through the trapdoor into darkness smelling of mold and damp roots, it felt uncomfortably like stepping off the edge of one life into another. The first chamber tried to strangle them. Harry landed in something cold, soft, and alive. It wrapped him at once, cords tightening round wrists and ankles, with the hideous intimacy of fingers learning the shapes of bones. Above him, Hermione gave a sharp cry as she struck the same mass. Ron swore. Severus, dropping last with enough control to land on his feet, vanished almost to the knee before the black vines recognized fresh prey and surged. "Don't move," Hermione shouted, breathless. "It like struggling its devil's snare." "Excellent time to mention that," Ron choked, already pinned to the shoulders. Severus had gone very still. Harry, fighting panic, understood the instruction an instant later. The plan tightened most on those who fought. Severus's wand hand remained half free. He spoke one clean incantation and blue-white flame roared along the edges of the chamber. Hermione, understanding at once, added her own charm. Orange fire blossomed. The plant recoiled in a shrieking rustle, releasing them. Harry rolled clear, coughing. Severus hauled Ron upright by the collar with no more gentleness than necessary. "Your famous Gryffindor initiative," he said, "continues to impress." Ron, rubbing vine marks from his throat, muttered, "We're alive, aren't we? By accident and Miss Granger's competence." The second chamber opened high above the first, narrow and full of beating wings. A locked door glinted on the far wall. Between them and it swarmed a storm of keys, thousands of silver shapes darting in erratic loops under the vaulted ceiling. One old broom leaned against the arch. Harry felt Severus' gaze on him. "Yes," Harry said. "All right." His hands closed around the broom handle. It was not nearly as good as a Nimbus 2000, but in the air it hardly mattered. The chamber's draft hit his face with a rush so familiar it cut through fear. Keys flashed around him like fish in a bright, dangerous river. He banked, dove, reached, missed. The key they needed had a bent wing. Hermione spotted it first. Ron shouted. Harry chased it into a corner near the ceiling and caught it hard enough to nearly break its spine. When he dropped to the stones again, panting, Severus took the key, opened the door, and said nothing at all. But there was a brief, unreadable expression in his eyes that made Harry think of the Quidditch pitch and of being watched by a man who understood flying better than he admitted. The third chamber smelled of dust and old conflict. Giant chess pieces stood ranked on a board set into the floor, white and black armies waiting in frozen hostility. Ron stopped dead. His whole face changed. "Oh," he said. "Oh, I know this." "Can you win?" Severus asked. Ron looked at the board, then at the pieces, then at the square arrangement with an intensity Harry had never seen in him over any textbook or class assignment. "Maybe. But we'll have to play." Severus glanced once toward the next archway, measuring time. Somewhere ahead, Quirrell moved closer to the stone. Somewhere behind them, the castle remained blissfully ignorant. He made the decision in a heartbeat. "Do it!" Ron directed them with startling authority. Harry took a bishop's place. Hermione a castle. Severus, after the briefest pause, stood where a black knight had been and looked as though he found the symbolism personally insulting. Ron himself became king. The White Army moved. The battle that followed was no child's game. Stone shattered stone. Blades rang on marble. Harry's piece was cut down and he leapt aside just as his bishop exploded into fragments. Hermione narrowly avoided being smashed by a rook. Severus moved like a duelist even in another shape, blocking, destroying, adapting. Ron stood at the center of it all, eyes fierce and brilliant, seeing lines 3 moves ahead. Then the White Queen came for him. "No," Hermione whispered, understanding before Harry did. Ron's mouth tightened. "It's the only way." He looked at Harry with a level gaze that made him seem years older than 11. "You have to go on." "Ron, just shut up and let me do it." The Queen's stone blade struck. Ron toppled, senseless, to the board. Harry shouted. Hermione made a raw sound and started forward, but the remaining pieces bowed. The path was open. Severus was already kneeling beside Ron. "He's alive," he said. "Concussed. Nothing worse." Hermione dropped down at once, shaking. "I'm staying." Harry looked from her to Ron to the next doorway. Everything in him wanted them together, wanted not to be split again into smaller and smaller numbers. But he knew the logic. Ron could not be moved quickly. Hermione would not leave him. Severus stood. Dust streaked his sleeves. There was a cut above one eyebrow where flying marble had grazed him. "Potter, got to eat." Harry faced him. "You and I continue." Hermione rose too. "Professor, there will be more ahead." "Yes." Severus looked at her with a degree of respect so fleeting another person might have missed it. "Stay with Weasley. If he wakes, do not let him attempt heroics. If anything comes through that door besides help, hex first and ask second." "Me. Duh." Hermione nodded fiercely. The next chamber was empty, except for a hulking troll sprawled face down on the floor. "Quirrell's own," Harry whispered. Severus checked the pulse with professional contempt. Unconscious, he used it as a battering ram and passed on. Beyond the troll waited 7 bottles on a table, and a fire barrier licking the walls purple-black. A single parchment lay beside the bottles. Harry reached for it. Severus took it first, scanned the lines, and exhaled through his nose. "My challenge." Harry blinked. "You made this?" Unfortunately, the logic puzzle would have stopped many adults. Harry saw that at once. The bottles varied in shape and size. Poison, nettle wine, forward, backward. 3 clues. Numbers and placement. Hermione would have solved it faster, but Severus, being the mind that had written the thing, needed only a few seconds to parse the intended traps. He selected 2 bottles. "This one will carry you through the black fire." He held out the smaller. "This one returns the drinker through the purple." Harry stared. "You're not coming." "I have no guarantee the amount suffices for more than one at a time, and if Quirrell is beyond the next chamber with the stone between you, my first priority is preventing him from leaving with either." Harry took the bottle. His hand shook. Severus seized his wrist before he could drink. "Listen to me." Harry looked up. "If the stone can be secured, secure it. If it cannot, delay him. Talk, lie, stall, run. Do not attempt a duel for which you are not remotely trained. If I am delayed, Dumbledore will come. Do you understand?" "No." Harry nodded. Severus's fingers tightened once, then released. "Good." Harry drank. Ice ran through him. The black flames turned translucent. He stepped through and emerged into the last chamber alone. Behind him, Severus swallowed the second bottle and entered the fire an instant later. Quirrell stood before the mirror of Arised with his back to the door, and his hands clenched so hard the knuckles showed bone white. The room was bright with torchlight reflected tenfold in the glass. The mirror itself dominated everything, its dark gold frame drinking shadows and casting them back in altered form. Harry saw at once that there was no stone in sight, no pedestal, no chest, no obvious hiding place. Only Quirrell, the mirror, and the hush of a room built for revelation. Quirrell turned. His face, without the usual performance of timidity, looked younger and worse at once. The stammer had vanished entirely. So had the harmlessness. "You," he said, and smiled. "I wondered if they would let you come this far." Harry's hand went to his wand. "Professor Snape's right behind me." Quirrell's smile thinned. "Yes, Severus has been very troublesome." He moved between Harry and the door with more grace than Harry would have believed possible. "Come here, Potter." Harry did not move. "You know," Quirrell went on conversationally, "I find this almost disappointing. The whole year you were meant to suspect him, and then he grew sentimental." Harry's pulse hammered. "He's not sentimental." "No." Quirrell tilted his head. "Protective, then. Curious choice of vice in that man." The scar on Harry's forehead began to burn. Not the sharp, tearing agony of the forest yet, but a gathering heat, a warning from inside his own flesh. Quirrell saw him touch it. His eyes brightened. "Yes," he said softly. "You can feel him, can't you?" Before Harry could answer, Quirrell unwound the turban. The cloth fell. There was a face on the back of his head. It was less a face than the memory of one forced into flesh too newly occupied. The features were pale and flat as wax, the mouth red and thin, the eyes scarlet and pitiless. Harry's body went cold in every joint at once. "Harry Potter," whispered the face. The scar ripped open with pain so fierce Harry nearly fell. "See what I have become?" said the high cold voice. "Mere shadow and vapor. I have form only when I can share another's body, but there have always been those willing to let me into their hearts and minds." Quirrell's own mouth twisted as if around bitterness or pride. Harry could not tell which. "The unicorn blood strengthened me," said the voice. "You saw. And once I have the stone, I shall have life again. Real life. Now, tell me, boy, what do you see in the mirror?" "Not me, and this you and I. Open. Harry, shaking, turned despite himself. He saw himself in the mirror, and his reflected self smiled and slipped something into his pocket. At once Harry knew. The stone was suddenly heavy against his leg. A surge of triumph shot through him so hot it nearly showed on his face. He dragged it back by force. Snape had said talk, lie stall. "I see." Harry swallowed. "I see myself shaking hands with Dumbledore. I've won the House Cup for Gryffindor." "No." Quirrell stared, uncertain, then swore under his breath. "He lies." The face on the back of his head hissed. "Use him." Quirrell advanced. "Come here." Harry backed away. "No, your insolence," said Quirrell, and there was now a wholly different quality in his voice, "is inherited." The black fire behind him burst outward. Severus Snape came through it like an arrow loosed too long ago and finally reaching its mark. "Step away from him." Quirrell spun. For one instant, fear showed raw in his face. Severus. The name from the second mouth was not fear. It was recognition sharpened to a knife. Severus stopped dead. Every color in him seemed to drain beneath the torchlight. Yet his wand never wavered. "My lord." The title struck Harry like a blow. It was not loyalty now. He could hear that. It was habit burned so deep into old terror that even opposition had to pass through it. "Interesting," whispered Voldemort's face. "You show yourself openly." Severus's expression became a mask. "You left me little room for subtlety. So you are truly Dumbledore's creature now." A dozen answers might have come. Severus chose none of them. Instead he said, Quirrell is a poor vessel. Release him." Quirrell laughed, a wild, frayed sound. "Release me? You would like that, wouldn't you? We might then resume our little games in corridors while your precious school thinks you noble." Severus flicked his wand. A scarlet curse struck Quirrell in the shoulder and hurled him sideways. Harry leapt back as shattered stones sprayed from the wall. Quirrell scrambled up with startling speed. Green light flashed. Severus met it with a shield charm that burst silver white. The room detonated into motion. Harry flattened himself beside the mirror, scar blazing, while spells cracked through the air. Quirrell fought like a desperate man who had spent the year pretending weakness and now no longer needed to hide the knife beneath it. Severus fought like someone who had long expected this duel and hoped never to live it. "Take the boy!" shrieked Voldemort. Quirrell lunged. Severus cursed the floor. Flagstones erupted. Quirrell vaulted them, hand outstretched. Harry drew his wand and shouted the first jinx that came to mind. It missed by a full yard and blasted a torch from its bracket. "Run!" Severus barked. Harry did not. He reached into his pocket, felt the stone, and knew with sudden sick certainty that if Quirrell left this room alive, he would take it. Quirrell saw the movement. His eyes locked on Harry's pocket. "You have it." He drove Severus back with a curse so violent it shattered part of the mirror's frame, then threw himself at Harry bodily. They hit the floor hard enough to knock breath and sense loose together. Quirrell's fingers closed on Harry's throat, and then he screamed. It was a sound of pure, astonished agony. Smoke curled from where skin met skin. Harry stared. Quirrell recoiled, hands blistering already. The red face on the back of his head twisted with fury. "Kill him, you fool! Kill him!" Understanding came not in logic but instinct. Harry flung himself forward and seized Quirrell's wrist. Quirrell shrieked again. Flesh reddened, split, charred beneath Harry's hand. Severus, half risen from where a curse had flung him against the wall, stared in disbelief. "Lily," he said under his breath. Quirrell thrashed. Harry clung with the blind ferocity of someone who has found the only possible weapon and cannot afford to wonder why it works. The scar pain became white fire. Voldemort's face writhed and spat soundless hatred. Quirrell clawed at Harry, trying to throw him off, but every touch burned him further. Then the door burst inward. Dumbledore entered in a rush of power that changed the room's very air. Quirrell convulsed. The pressure behind Harry's eyes lifted all at once as something cold and furious tore free of the room like a wind forced through a crack. Harry glimpsed blackness streaming upward, heard a scream that was not sound, and then everything tilted. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Severus trying to reach him through the wreckage, his face for once stripped of every familiar cruelty and laid bare as terror. When Harry woke, it was to sunlight and the smell of clean linen. For several confused seconds he thought he was back in the smallest bedroom at Privet Drive and had dreamed the entire year. The castle, the classes, the mirror, the face on the back of Quirrell's head. Then he saw the hospital wings, vaulted ceiling, and the curtains between the beds, and knew he had not imagined anything nearly so strange. His body hurt as though he had spent the night being trampled by trolls. His scar ached dully. On the table beside him lay a pile of chocolate frog wrappers that suggested visitors had come and gone. "You have been asking for half the school," said a mild voice. Dumbledore sat in a chair by the bed, hands folded, looking exactly like a wizard who had not recently burst into a chamber and driven a bodiless Dark Lord from a professor's skull. Only the shadows under his eyes suggested otherwise. "Sir." Harry tried to push himself up. Dumbledore prevented it with one hand. "Madame Pomfrey asked me to prevent heroics for at least another hour." Harry blinked. "What happened?" Dumbledore considered him for a moment. "You thwarted a very dangerous plan. You nearly killed yourself. Professor Snape has been in a mood that would sour milk at 20 paces. In short, matters continue much as one might expect. Quirrell." "Dead." The word lay flat and hard. Harry swallowed. "And Voldemort?" Dumbledore's expression became unreadable. "Gone from this place. though not perhaps gone from the world as thoroughly as we might wish. Harry stared at the blankets. He remembered smoke rising from Quirrell's skin where Harry touched him. He remembered the red eyes, the voice like ice splinters, Snape saying "my lord" with old horror in it. Professor Snape saw him. Dumbledore's gaze sharpened. Yes. Will that matter? A great many things will matter, Dumbledore said softly. Not all at once. Harry hesitated. Questions crowded him. About the stone. About why touching him had hurt Quirrell. About why Snape had looked frightened. About why Dumbledore trusted a former Death Eater with the life of the boy that Death Eater had every reason, by ordinary logic, to despise. Perhaps Dumbledore saw the shape of at least one of those questions, because he said, "Your mother died to save you. The protection born of that sacrifice lives in your skin still." Quirrell, with Voldemort inhabiting him, could not bear it. Harry closed his eyes briefly. His mother again. Always a story waiting just beyond what people would say. And Snape? He asked. Dumbledore's hands linked more tightly. Professor Snape made terrible choices as a younger man. He has spent many years living with them. That's not an answer. No. Dumbledore's blue gaze was very clear. It is the beginning of one. You are old enough, I think, to know that remorse is not graceful. It does not improve a man's temper or make him easy company. Sometimes it only binds him to the right side of a war long after warmth has left him. Harry thought of Snape in the mirror chamber, of the way fear had cracked his face when Harry collapsed. He hated my dad. Yes. And me. Dumbledore was silent long enough for the wing clock to tick 7 times. I think, he said at last, that he has often mistaken resemblance for identity. Harry frowned. What does that mean? It means, said Dumbledore, rising, that some burdens are carried badly and faithfully all the same. It was exactly the sort of answer that gave nothing and somehow stayed with one for years. Before Harry could object, the ward doors banged open and Ron and Hermione burst in, both checked only slightly by Madame Pomfrey's outraged squawk. Ron's ears were pink with emotion he would rather have died than call emotion. Hermione was already crying and trying not to. You're awake. You idiot. We thought. Did you really? They talked over one another for a full minute before any sense emerged. Ron had regained consciousness in the chess room with the Queen's sword-shaped dent in his temple and a headache that made him complain heroically for 2 days. Hermione had hexed a suit of armor that mistook Ron's snores for a burglary alarm. Severus had sent help back for them once Dumbledore arrived. No one outside a tiny circle of adults knew the full truth. The official story involved Quirrell attempting to steal a dangerous object, Harry being found nearby, and details best omitted for the peace of mind of governors and parents. Snape came to see us, Hermione said when they had settled somewhat. Well, not to see us exactly, to ask questions. But he looked. She searched for a word and failed. Like someone had sat on his cauldron, Ron offered. Hermione glared. No, worse, quieter. Harry looked down at the wrappers on his lap. He saw Voldemort. Neither of them answered at once. Ron finally said, very carefully, "Do you still think he's, bad?" Harry considered. The question would once have been easy. Not now. He was bad, Harry said at last. I think that's different. Hermione nodded slowly, as if she too had been circling something like that without language. Ron made a face. You two are getting disgustingly sensible. Madame Pomfrey threw them out 10 minutes later. Harry was alone again when Severus came. He entered without drama, carrying a small tray with 2 potion phials on it, as though that were the sole purpose of his existence, and not an excuse convenient enough to satisfy Pomfrey. His robes were immaculate. His face, at first glance, had resumed its usual cool severity. Only the deepened shadows around his mouth and eyes betrayed sleeplessness. Drink this, he said, setting 1 vial on the table. Unless you have developed a new interest in lingering headaches. Harry obeyed before deciding whether obedience was appropriate. The potion tasted of mint and iron. Severus waited until he had swallowed. "The second is for tonight. You may spare the hospital wing your dramatic relapses if you take it before bed." Harry nodded. Silence swelled. It was strange to have Snape standing there with no class around them, no audience for sarcasm, no immediate crisis requiring motion. The room seemed too bright for the history between them, too white and clean. At last Harry said, "You called him my lord." A faint, humorless smile touched Severus' mouth. "Did I?" "Yes. I imagine old habits survive even when one wishes them buried." Harry looked at him. "He knew you were against him." "Yes." That single syllable carried more consequence than most speeches. Harry, who had grown up among adults whose angers involved broken plates and shut doors, understood almost nothing of spycraft or terror or the kind of war in which names themselves could be fatal. But he understood enough to hear in that yes the fracture of some future plan. "Because of me?" he asked. Severus's eyes sharpened. "Do not flatter yourself. If my cover is damaged, it is because Quirrell forced a public game too early and his master mistook weakness for cunning." "Nay, that's not a no. It is the only answer you are getting." Harry nearly smiled despite himself. It felt wrong and right in equal measure. Severus reached for the second vial, adjusted it by a finger's breadth on the table, then said without looking at him, "Your mother's protection saved you, not your recklessness. Do not confuse the two." Harry's throat tightened unexpectedly. "You said her name." Severus went still. A long moment passed. Somewhere far off a door shut, and the sound came thin through the ward. Then Severus said, very quietly, "There are names you may hear 100 times from those who knew them less and understand nothing." He turned as if to leave. "Professor," Harry said. Severus stopped. "Thank you." The words seemed to make him physically uncomfortable. His shoulders altered in a movement so small Harry might have imagined it. "You survived," he said. "Reserve gratitude for miracles." Then he was gone. Harry lay back and stared at the ceiling, feeling the world change shape around the absence he left. By the time he was released from the hospital wing, the end-of-year feast had become an event with two atmospheres. One belonged to the school at large. Relief, excitement, the last blaze of banners before summer. Slytherin had expected to win the House Cup again, and wore the expression of a kingdom informed too late that a smaller neighboring state had discovered cavalry. Gryffindor, though not yet officially victorious, vibrated with the hope of it. The other atmosphere belonged to the handful who knew what had really happened. Harry, walking into the great hall beside Ron and Hermione, felt the usual awe but threaded now with the knowledge that the hall's candles shone over adults capable of keeping entire wars under tablecloth conversation. Quirrell's seat sat empty. No explanation beyond illness and departure had been publicly offered. Most students accepted that because children were mercifully good at leaving gaps where adults put them. Harry was no longer sure he would ever again accept a gap without wanting to peer into it. Dumbledore rose to speak. The hall hushed. He awarded points with maddening theatrical timing. Neville's courage, Hermione's nerve, Ron's chess, Harry's nerve, and outstanding bravery. And the banners changed at the last instant from green to red and gold. Gryffindor's table exploded. Fred and George attempted to lift Harry bodily. Percy Weasley actually wept, and then claimed it was smoke. Through the chaos, Harry looked up at the staff table. Snape sat in his usual place, black against the bright celebration, applauding with measured civility and not a particle more. His face revealed nothing as Gryffindor roared its triumph into the rafters. Yet when Harry, by accident or intention, caught his eye across the hall, there was no old, uncomplicated animosity there any longer. Not liking. Certainly not liking. But something harder to bear. Recognition, perhaps. Not of equality. Not yet. Harry was still a child and Snape still the least comforting adult in the castle. But recognition that the other existed now beyond caricature. That a simple villain had become a wounded man. That a reckless boy had become, however briefly, a participant in the adult dark. On the train ride home, Ron ate enough to suggest famine threatened King's Cross. Hermione made revision schedules for next year, and then, under pressure, admitted she might burn them. Harry watched fields rush by under summer light and thought of mirrors and forest clearings, and the look on Snape's face when Voldemort had spoken his name. At the station, Hagrid's absence left a gap large enough to feel. Mr. and Mrs. Weasley folded Ron into a family noise that made Harry ache with envy and warmth together. Uncle Vernon's mustache appeared beyond the barrier like a threat from another, pettier universe. Before Harry stepped toward it, he turned. Far off, impossible really from this distance, and yet he would later swear it was true. The silhouette of Hogwarts stood in his mind as sharply as if he could see it through brick and country and sky. High in a dark window, or perhaps only in memory, stood a man in black, watching a train carry away a boy he had once intended to despise without complication, and could no longer do so. Harry faced the Dursleys and the summer and the ordinary cruelties waiting there. He did not feel older in the sentimental way books like to describe. He felt less protected by innocence and more certain that courage, in the world he belonged to now, was never clean. Men who had served monsters might stand between children and death. Kind giants might betray secrets by loving too openly. Wise old headmasters might tell truths in slices thin enough to see through. And hatred, once examined, could turn out to be only the outer bark of stranger loyalties, rooted deeper than anyone wished to name. "Boy!" roared Uncle Vernon. Harry picked up his trunk. This time, as he walked toward the shout, he carried with him not only a wand and school books and the memory of a castle. He carried the first rough knowledge that the war which had shaped his life had not ended the night his parents died. It had only gone underground, into teachers' eyes and hidden rooms, and the hearts of people who had chosen badly once, and had been choosing, ever since, what to do about it. And for the first time in his life, that knowledge did not make him feel smaller. It made him feel responsible.